On a cold morning in March of 1994, in Marshall County, Iowa, a man named Gerald Hoffmann walked into the John Deere dealership in Marshalltown and told the sales manager he was done. Not done farming, done with John Deere. He'd been a John Deere customer for 22 years. His father had been a John Deere customer before that. There was a green 4020 sitting in his equipment shed that his father had bought new in 1967, and Gerald had kept running out of respect for the man who'd bought it. Not because he needed it anymore, but because some things you don't get rid of just because they're old. The sales manager's name was Phil Adler. He was 44 years old, had worked at that dealership for 18 years, and had sold Gerald Hoffmann 4 tractors, 2 combines, and a planter over the course of their relationship. He considered Gerald one of his best customers, which is why, when Gerald set his account folder on the counter and said what he said, Phil Adler did not take it well. "Gerald," Phil said, "whatever the problem is, we can work it out. We always work it out." Gerald shook his head. "It's not a problem you can work out, Phil. I've been telling you for 2 years that the 8960 is giving me trouble. I've been telling you the dealer support isn't there when I need it. I've been telling you the parts lead times are hurting me. And every time I tell you, you send a technician out who can't find anything wrong, hand me a cup of coffee, and tell me to be patient." Phil started to say something. Gerald raised one hand, not aggressively, just firmly, the way a man does when he's finished being interrupted. "I'm not angry," Gerald said. "I'm just done. I've already talked to the Case IH dealer in Ames. I'm picking up a Magnum 7140 next Tuesday." The room went quiet. There was a parts counter behind Phil where 2 employees were working, and they both stopped what they were doing. There was a waiting area off to the side where a farmer Gerald recognized from 2 townships over was sitting with a cup of coffee, and he looked up from the magazine in his lap. Phil Adler looked at Gerald Hoffmann for a long moment. Then he said something that Gerald would remember for the next 4 years, and that Phil Adler would spend the next 4 years wishing he could take back. "Gerald," he said, "you're making a mistake. Case IH isn't what they're telling you they are. Their support out here is thin, their parts availability is worse than ours, and that Magnum has issues they haven't sorted out yet. You're going to be on the phone to Ames every time something goes wrong, and believe me, something is going to go wrong." He paused, looked at the account folder on the counter, then back at Gerald. "When it does," he said, and his voice had an edge to it that was just barely within the bounds of professional, "don't expect us to be in a hurry to help you." Gerald picked up his folder, nodded once, and walked out into the March cold. He drove home on county roads he'd driven his whole life, past fields that were still frozen, past fence lines that needed work, past the stone marker at the corner of his property that his grandfather had set in 1923. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel angry. He felt the way a man feels when he's made a decision that can't be undone, and he's not entirely sure yet whether it was right. But he was sure of one thing. He was sure he'd been talking to the wrong people for 2 years and getting nowhere. And he was sure that doing the same thing again and expecting a different result was something his father had warned him about before Gerald was old enough to drive a tractor. Before we go any further into this story, if you've ever made a decision that everyone around you said was wrong, and then had to live inside that decision long enough to find out the truth, this channel is for you. Hit subscribe. Stay with us. These farming stories take time to tell properly, and this one is worth every minute. Let me tell you about Gerald Hoffmann, because you need to understand the man before you can understand the choice he made and what it cost him before it paid him back. Gerald was 51 years old in 1994. He farmed 480 acres in Marshall County, a mix of corn and soybeans on ground his grandfather had homesteaded and his father had expanded through careful decades of work and zero debt. Gerald had inherited the farm in 1979 when his father, August Hoffmann, died of a heart attack at 68 while walking a fence line in early November. Gerald had been 36 years old, had a wife named Ruth, 2 daughters in grade school, and a farm that was paid for and profitable if you ran it right. He'd run it right. Through the farm crisis of the early 1980s, when neighbors on both sides of him went under and the land changed hands at foreclosure auctions Gerald attended but never bid at, he kept farming. He had no debt to begin with, which helped. He had his father's habit of buying only what he could pay for, which helped more. And he had a mind that worked slowly and carefully on problems, the way minds do when they've been trained by people who understood that a bad decision made quickly is almost always worse than a good decision made slowly. The trouble with the John Deere 8960 had started in 1992, 2 years after Gerald bought it. The tractor was a power shift model, one of the biggest John Deere had to offer at the time, 360 horsepower, built for large-scale row crop operations. On paper, it was exactly what Gerald needed for his 480 acres. In practice, it had an intermittent hydraulic issue that caused the front wheel assist to disengage without warning in field conditions. Not every time, not predictably, just sometimes, when Gerald was in the middle of a field and could least afford it. He'd reported it to Phil Adler the first time in the spring of 1992. A technician came out, ran diagnostics, found nothing definitive, made an adjustment that Gerald was told should resolve the issue. It didn't. Gerald called again in the fall. Another technician, another visit, another adjustment, another assurance. By the spring of 1993, Gerald had documented 11 separate incidents in a notebook he kept in the tractor cab, with dates, field conditions, hours on the meter, and exactly what had happened each time. He brought the notebook to Phil Adler in July of 1993 and set it on the same counter where he would eventually set his account folder 8 months later. Phil had looked at the notebook. He'd been apologetic, professional, and ultimately ineffective. The tractor went back to the shop for 3 days. It came back with a new hydraulic control valve and a warranty extension on that component. Gerald put it back to work. In September of 1993, the front wheel assist disengaged during harvest, and Gerald lost 2 hours of combining time on a day when rain was coming, and he couldn't afford to lose 2 hours. He called the Case 1H dealer in Ames the following Monday. His name was a man named Tom Breckenridge, and he'd been selling Case 1H equipment in central Iowa for 11 years. Tom drove out to Gerald's farm on a Wednesday afternoon without being asked twice, walked the equipment shed with Gerald for an hour, listened carefully while Gerald explained exactly what he needed from a tractor for his specific operation, and came back the following Friday with specifications on 3 different Magnum models and a parts availability report for Marshall County that Gerald hadn't asked for but immediately recognized as exactly the kind of information he needed. Gerald spent 6 weeks making his decision. He compared specifications, called other farmers who ran Case 1H equipment, visited 2 operations in neighboring counties where the Magnum 7140 was the primary row crop tractor. He asked hard questions and wrote down the answers. Then he went back to Tom Breckenridge with a list of 12 specific requirements and told him that if the Magnum 7140 could meet all 12, they had a deal. Tom went through the list one item at a time and answered every question directly, without hedging, without the kind of smooth, professional reassurance that Gerald had learned to distrust. 2 of the items on Gerald's list required Tom to make phone calls to the regional office before he could answer accurately. Tom made those calls while Gerald sat in his office, got the answers, and came back with the information, rather than with a guess dressed up as certainty. They had a deal. Now let me tell you about what happened in Marshalltown after Gerald Hoffmann switched brands, because in a farming community in central Iowa in 1994, switching from John Deere to Case IH was not a quiet personal decision. It was news. It was the kind of news that traveled from the co-op to the cafe to the equipment auction and back again within a week, picking up commentary at every stop. The commentary was not encouraging. Harold Voss, who farmed 600 acres to Gerald's north and had run John Deere equipment for 30 years, said Gerald was making an emotional decision based on one bad tractor, and that he'd regret it before the first planting season was out. Harold was not a man who said things to be cruel. He was a man who had strong opinions and a tendency to express them whether or not he'd been asked. Dennis Schulte, who was the president of the local Farm Bureau chapter and had a Case IH hat he'd gotten as a promotional item at a trade show that he wore occasionally but clearly didn't take seriously, said he hoped Gerald knew what he was getting into, because Case IH's service network in Marshall County was thinner than people realized, and parts availability was the real issue when you were in the middle of planting season and something broke. Gerald's neighbor to the south, a quiet man named Warren Aiken, who had farmed 320 acres his entire adult life and had opinions about almost nothing publicly, stopped Gerald at the mailbox one afternoon in early April and said simply that he hoped it worked out and that he'd be watching with interest. Warren said it without judgment and without the particular tone that people use when they say they hope something works out, but actually expect it to fail. Gerald appreciated that more than he said. The Magnum 7140 arrived at Gerald's farm on a Tuesday in late March, transported on a flatbed from the Case 1H dealer in Ames. Tom Breckenridge came with it, spent 4 hours with Gerald going through every system on the machine, walked him through the hydraulics, the power shift transmission, the front axle, the electronic monitoring system. He left a direct phone number that rang to his desk, not to a receptionist, not to a general service line, to his desk. Gerald planted corn that spring with a tractor he'd owned for 3 weeks. It is not a comfortable thing, putting an unfamiliar machine to serious work in the first weeks of ownership. Every sound it makes is a question you don't yet know how to answer. Every vibration requires a moment of interpretation that an experienced operator does automatically, but a new owner does consciously, carefully, with one ear always cocked towards something that might be wrong. The Magnum didn't give him anything to worry about. It ran through that first planting season with a steadiness that Gerald noticed specifically because he'd spent 2 years driving a tractor that kept him slightly anxious, always half waiting for the hydraulics to do something unexpected. The front wheel assist engaged every time he engaged it and disengaged every time he disengaged it, which sounds like the minimum you could ask of a piece of equipment, but which Gerald had learned to understand was not always a given. By June of 1994, 3 months into his ownership, Gerald had formed a preliminary opinion. By November, after a full crop year, that opinion had become something firmer. The tractor worked the way he needed it to work. When he'd had a question about the hydraulic settings in July, he'd called Tom Breckenridge's direct line and had an answer within 2 hours. When a sensor had thrown an error code in August that turned out to be nothing more than a loose connector, a technician had been at his farm by the following morning, fixed it in 40 minutes, and left without charging him for the call under warranty. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't go to the co-op and announce that he'd been right. He didn't stop Harold Voss at the equipment auction to report his satisfaction. He just kept farming, kept paying attention, kept making notes in the same kind of notebook he'd kept in the John Deere cab. Except now the notes were operational observations rather than incident reports. The second year was better than the first. The third year better than the second. Gerald added a Case IH 2166 combine in 1996, replacing the John Deere 9600 he'd been running. Tom Breckenridge handled the transaction with the same directness he'd shown from the beginning, and the combine performed through its first harvest without giving Gerald a single reason to write anything critical in his notebook. By 1997, 3 years into his switch, Gerald Hoffmann had become something he'd never set out to become. He'd become a reference point. When farmers in Marshall County asked questions about Case IH equipment, his name came up. Not because he'd promoted himself, not because he'd campaigned for the brand at Farm Bureau meetings or put a Case IH sign at the end of his lane, but because people had watched him make the switch, had waited for him to fail the way Phil Adler and Harold Voss and Dennis Schulte had suggested he would, and had instead watched 3 years of quiet, consistent success. Warren Aiken stopped him at the mailbox again in the fall of 1997. He'd been watching, he said. He had a question about the Magnum's fuel consumption compared to the equivalent John Deere. Gerald answered him specifically, from memory, with numbers he'd been tracking since the first year. Warren listened, thanked him, and drove home. 6 months later, Warren Aiken bought a Case IHM X170 from Tom Breckenridge in Ames. Now let me tell you about the spring of 1998, because that's when the story turned in a direction that Gerald hadn't anticipated and that Phil Adler probably hadn't anticipated either. It was April, early in the planting season, and Gerald was in his equipment shed doing pre-season checks on the Magnum when a truck pulled into the yard. A green truck, a truck with the John Deere logo on the door. Gerald straightened up and watched it park. Phil Adler got out. He was 48 years old now and looked more tired than Gerald remembered. The dealership had gone through a difficult stretch. Several large accounts in the county had either reduced their purchases significantly or switched brands entirely in the years since 1994. The farm economy had moved through cycles that were unkind to high overhead businesses, and a dealership that depended on selling expensive iron in a county where farmers were becoming more cautious with capital felt those cycles acutely. Phil walked across the yard with his hands in his jacket pockets. Gerald waited. Phil said he'd been meaning to come out for a while. Said he'd heard from several people that Gerald's operation was running well. Said he'd heard specifically about the fuel consumption numbers on the Magnum and the service response times from the Case IH dealer in Ames, which had apparently become something of a benchmark that farmers in the county mentioned when they talked about what good dealer support looked like. Gerald listened without saying anything. Phil said that when Gerald had left in March of 1994, he'd told him not to expect John Deere to be in a hurry to help him if things went wrong. He said that was unprofessional and unfair, and that he'd regretted saying it almost immediately. He said he'd been in the business long enough to know that a customer who tells you about a problem for 2 years before walking out the door is a customer who wanted to stay, and that the failure to solve Gerald's problem with the 8960 was a failure of the dealership's service operation, not a failure of Gerald's patience. He wasn't there to ask Gerald to come back, he said. He understood that wasn't realistic. He was there because Gerald Hoffmann had been a customer for 22 years and had left with more dignity than Phil deserved, and because Phil Adler was 48 years old and had been in this business long enough to understand that some things needed to be said, whether or not they changed anything. Gerald looked at him for a moment. Then he said something that Phil Adler wrote down when he got back to his truck, because he didn't want to forget it. Gerald said, "Phil, I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because I couldn't afford to keep waiting for a problem to be solved that wasn't being solved. That's not personal. That's farming. When something isn't working, you find what does." He paused. "I appreciate you coming out. That took something." They shook hands in the yard. Phil Adler drove back to Marshalltown, Gerald went back to his preseason checks. Harold Voss heard about the visit within the week, the way things travel in a county where people know each other's business. He didn't say anything publicly, but that fall, Harold Voss traded in his John Deere 8970 and bought a Case IH Magnum 8910. He didn't tell anyone he was doing it until it was done, and he didn't explain his reasoning to anyone who asked. He just said he'd been looking at the numbers and the numbers made sense. Gerald Hoffmann is still farming in Marshall County. He's 81 years old now, and his son-in-law runs the day-to-day operation on the 480 acres that is still, after all these decades, entirely free of debt. The Magnum 7140 was replaced years ago, but it was replaced with another Case IH, and that one with another after it. Tom Breckenridge retired from the dealership in Ames in 2011, and Gerald drove to Ames for his retirement dinner, one of maybe 30 customers who showed up without being formally invited, simply because they thought Tom deserved to see the people he'd served showing up to say so. The green 4020 his father bought new in 1967 is still in the equipment shed. Gerald maintains it, starts it once a month. It runs as well as it ever did. He's not going to sell it. Some things you keep not because you need them, but because they connect you to the people who came before you. And losing that connection is a different kind of poverty than the financial kind. When people ask Gerald what made him switch, he usually gives a short answer. He says he was having a problem that wasn't getting fixed, and he found someone who fixed it. That's the short answer, and it's accurate as far as it goes. The longer answer, the one he gives when someone asks the right way and he has the time, goes something like this. He says that brand loyalty in farming is a real thing, and it comes from a real place, from fathers who bought a certain color and passed that preference down the way they passed down everything else worth keeping. He says he doesn't think less of John Deere equipment because of what happened with the 8960. He says that machine had a problem, and the support structure around it in Marshall County in the early 1990s wasn't equipped to solve that particular problem, and that's a specific failure in a specific time and place, not an indictment of everything green. But he also says this. He says that the most important thing Phil Adler ever did for him was come to his yard in April of 1998 and say what he said without asking for anything in return. Because that told Gerald something about the kind of man Phil was underneath the professional performance, and it told him that the relationship they'd had for 22 years had meant something real, even when it ended badly. That kind of honesty, Gerald says, is rarer than good equipment, and it lasts longer. There's something I want to say directly before we close this story out, and it's something I think about every time I sit with a story like Gerald's. We spend a lot of time in farming communities, and in life generally, treating loyalty to a brand or a system or a way of doing things as though it's the same as integrity, as though staying is always the brave choice and leaving is always the weak one. Gerald Hoffmann stayed with a brand for 22 years because it worked, and he left when it stopped working. And neither of those decisions was about pride. Both of them were about farming, about what the land needed, what the operation needed, what a man with 480 acres and a responsibility to keep that ground productive owed to himself and to the grandfather who had first broken it. The bravery wasn't in staying. The bravery wasn't in leaving either. The bravery was in being honest enough with himself to know the difference between loyalty that serves you and loyalty that costs you, and being willing to act on that honesty even when everyone around him was waiting for him to fail. Phil Adler drove to Gerald's yard 4 years later, not because Gerald had won and Phil had lost. He drove there because some reckonings are worth making even when they don't change anything practical. That's not weakness. That's the kind of character that farming communities were built on, and that we'd do well to remember when we're tempted to let pride make our decisions for us. If this story landed with you today, if it reminded you of a decision you've been second-guessing, or a conversation you know you need to have, drop one word in the comments that describes Gerald Hoffmann. Just one. I read every single one, and they matter more than you know. Share this with someone who's been holding on to something that isn't working anymore, who needs to hear that changing course isn't the same as giving up. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is exactly the right time. There are more stories like this one, and I want you here for all of them.